realised when I spoke to you all outside that I didn't say who I was. So I'm Wendy Killeen, and my daughter Tash was out there with me. She's just in the kitchen. But so Natasha and I welcome you all, and we've wanted to share our love of port with good friends and Stanton Killeen friends and our very dear friends, the Pfeiffers, and our team. And this has been a long time coming. Today we have our very special guests, Chris and Robin and Jen Pfeiffer. Jen has, well, a long history of port consumption and with the Killeens and others. And Jen has actually done 2 vintages in Porto, and she also has made her own port, Ruby Port, in Portugal. Chris and Robin have travelled to Portugal and experienced all sorts of different styles of port, as well as us, and I'm sure all of you have tried many different ports. Our other special guest today is our winemaker, Adriaan Foot. Adriaan started with us in January, and our very special person in our life here at Stanton Killeen is Sam Cooper. Put your hand up, Sam. And Sam has created this for us, this beautiful book.
It's excellent.
And she has done an enormous amount of research, and as you read through it during the day and take it home, you'll see just how much work she has put into that. So that's for you to take home and make reference to as you go along. The wines we're tasting today are listed, but before we get started, I guess I'd just like to say I was in Western Australia at a conference last week, and there was a lot of talk about storytelling in the wine industry, and that's what really gives the lasting impression that people have of you as a person or you as a winery or a wine product. And I think our story is very important too. So, you know, the Stanton and Killeen story is an old story. Stanton started producing wine in 1875, so in 2 years' time we will have our 150th anniversary. My father-in-law Norman married Joan Stanton in 1948, then started the Stanton and Killeen business or partnership. What Tash and I have in the cellar in the museum are the earliest bottles of vintage port we have were made by Jack Stanton, so he was the 4th generation. And so we have a couple of bottles of 1966, some 64, and there's older muscat there too that is early 60s, but not of any quantities. So we know that we were making vintage port in those days. Then Norman came along, and he was a sheep scientist. He had no wine experience, so when he married Joan, he got to know wine, and he grew our business. Our business was very tiny by the time he married Joan, because in the early days of the wine industry, it was a man's world. It was very patriarchal, and Jack Stanton had twin daughters. And of course, there weren't women in the wine industry, and his wife had died, so he was selling off land, and Norm came along and started buying up land and formed the partnership with Jack. So Norm came along and he started making vintage port as well as all the other wine, and we actually have a 1972 vintage today of Norm's wine, which is really interesting. Then in the early 80s, I married Chris, and that was a really interesting time. The 80s were an amazing period of time. And so we had a lot of lovely friends in the wine industry here in Rutherglen. We had, you know, the Gehrigs were big port producers, Stephen and Elizabeth Morris, who are now at Pennyweight and Beechworth, Chris and Robin, and I'm missing one. No? Anyway, there were a few of us. Andy Buller, the lovely Andy. And so we drank a lot of port together, and we were interested in port, so we weren't just glugging down bottles that we pulled off the shelf. In the early 80s, David Guimarães came to Australia. David Guimarães is from Fladgate Yateman, Taylor Fladgate Yateman. That's the family group in Portugal. The other main family group in Portugal is the Symington Group. So David Guimarães studied winemaking at Adelaide University, and during virtually every holiday he came to Rutherglen. We spent all of our time with David at dinner parties, water skiing on Lake Moodamere, drinking port, doing all sorts of lovely things together, and that family friendship still exists. I caught up with David in Portugal in 2018. So that's how our love of port grew. It became an obsession, I guess, with Chris and the family. I keep saying it wasn't just Chris, but it was an obsession with Chris. He wanted to make the very best vintage port in Australia, and in the late 80s, early 90s, we planted a number of Portuguese port varieties, and his first real vintage port of that Portuguese era was 1997, and those wines won numerous trophies and awards, and if you have a look out in the shop later, you'll see all the accolades that those wines have received. And he died in 2007 of cancer, and I would have to say when he died, at the time he died, he had really nailed his goal in being the best, apart from the Pfeiffers. He really nailed that ambition to be the greatest vintage port producer in Australia. And of course, we had never made table wine with those varieties. And after he died, the family created a table wine called the Prince, which is a blend of those varieties, and some of you may know that wine. Since then, we now make 6 or 7 different table wines, and we've planted 2 Portuguese whites. I've been back to Portugal, so in the days when Chris and I were married, we were over there in 94 and 97. I've been to Portugal I've been to Porto 3 times, and I was in Lisbon last September. So we say it's our point of difference, and it's really exciting time for us. So I'll hand you over to Chris. First bracket is Australian vintage port. The second bracket is Portuguese, and as you can see, they're all lined up there. I just have to say one more thing. We have a special guest here today, Cliff Mee. Now, Cliff came to us when we sent the email out to say, oh, we're doing this port event, and Cliff had said, oh, I've got some port, can I come too? So we said, absolutely. So Cliff has brought along 2 different vintage wines, and so thank you very much.
Pleasure.
And Cliff is, I would say, just knowing him for the last 2 hours, an expert, or an enthusiast, an obsessive maybe? No.
Yeah.
Anyway, so Cliff is going to give some commentary as well.
Good person to know.
Please enjoy, and let's start with Chris, just talking about...
Well, thank you, Wendy, and thanks for having us here today. It's terrific to be here. We have 2 brackets today. We have the Australian bracket and we have the Portuguese bracket. The Australian bracket is really a story of evolution in the style, and this is, I guess, where Chris and I in particular became very close in trying to work together to make significant changes in the style in the vintage port, or as we now call it, Australian Fortified Red. Back in the 70s, probably all the big names we know of now were in there making these styles of wines. But I think the big difference was, in terms in those days to today, was the level of ripeness they were achieving in their grapes. So they were really trying to get their grapes really ripe. That has a couple of results. One is when you ferment it, you actually make more natural alcohol and don't have to add as much alcohol. But the other is the fruit flavour is quite ripe, or it's sort of rich in those sort of characters. And particularly you used to see from the wines that were made in this area, as well as the McLaren Vale, you've got those liquoricey sort of characters, which was the ripeness of the Shiraz. And that was the main grape that was used in those times, was Shiraz. So that led us through that period to the time where the wine shows came in and put down a requirement that vintage ports must be under 5 Beaumont, which is a measure of sugar, which is actually at the sweeter end of what they would do in Portugal. Most of the Portuguese wines would be in that sort of 3 to 4.3 range. So it was quite a little bit riper, and so you got a little bit more sweetness in those wines. And the wine show was driving that. From those 70s, we started to see fruit being picked a little earlier, so the fruit becomes what we as winemakers would call fresher and brighter, and those would be the flavours that you're tasting. And then the spirit we're adding becomes a little bit more prominent because we have to add more. Typically today, if you're making a vintage port style, you're probably adding somewhere between 14 and 16% by volume of a lower strength spirit. And a lower strength spirit to us is 80% alcohol. Higher strength spirit's 96% alcohol, so which is neutral, but a lower strength spirit has character, and that's what some people refer to as brandy spirit. technically brandy has to be in wood for 2 years to be able to call it. So, but the spirit that we would use could be aged for brandy because it's at that lower strength. And in the distillation process, you get more flavour coming off in lower strength spirit. So these wines will show some of the influence of that brandy character. Now, tasting, because we've got to get into it, don't we? We've got to get into it. In terms of tasting, we've gone from oldest to youngest. And that's been done because the oldest should be the softest wines, okay, in your mouth. And then as you come round, the tannin will build, or should build, because the things that I look for in vintage porters, the fruit flavour, the sweetness level, the balance in the wine, and that balance with the tannin that you extract from the grapes and the spirit, which gives you the dryness on the finish. Now this style, rather than finishing sweet, like a muscat wood or a topake wood, port styles finish dry. Once again, Portuguese have been very clever. They make you want to have a second glass, okay? Rather than leaving your mouth full of rich flavours, your mouth is left quite clean, and that's where that spirit and the tannins come really into play in the wine, and actually drying it off, still leaving you with lovely flavours, but not flavour that sits there for half an hour like an old muscat would sit there in your mouth. So encouraging you to have the second glass.
In terms of how you taste the wine, just to help you, Dad, I would just say it's important to have a look at the colour. You can see it's quite different in the semicircle there. You've got some, really quite developed colours, showing those tawny like characters in the 53 and the 83. Some of the older wines still have a lot of depth of colour, but are showing more brick red in the hue. So I think it's good to have a look at all of your colours first and just observe that. Then I personally am going to smell them all before I taste them. So smell them all and do the comparison on the nose, and then go through and taste them all. And as Chris said, you're going to see more assertiveness in the wine as they become younger. But let's get into it, because this is an amazing opportunity.
I've been coming to Stanton Killeen since I was a little kid, and I used to run around under the barrels and muck around outside whilst my parents did all the boring stuff with the wine, but then grew up loving it as well. And this has been a great tasting today, just to try wines through the history of Stanton Killeen, and it's been fantastic to see how the wines have evolved to using more Portuguese varieties, which I think give the wines a heap more complexity than they had, although they were still great, in earlier years. It's been brilliant. It's been a fantastic tasting.
We're really appreciating the privilege of being here at Stanton Killeen to experience some of these amazing wines from so many different vintages.
So many different places.
Different places, Portugal, Australia, different suppliers, and it's amazing to see how some of the wines have been have such intensity of colour and flavour.
Yeah, even after 70 years.
Even at 50 and 70 years age,
yeah.
And also to experience that changing style as things moved on, and both the change of winemaking and the change of the grape style that they were picking up. Yeah.
It's been fantastic.
So,
hopefully another one in 5 years or 10 years.
yeah. So we feel very privileged to be part of this whole experience. Thank you.
Thank you.
National.
Almost finished bracket one. We'll go outside and we'll grab some cheese and go outside and while we refresh the table soon. But I would like to ask Adriaan Foot, our winemaker, to comment on this first bracket of wine.
First of all, thank you, Wendy and Natasha, for just hosting this wonderful event. It is a massive privilege just to be able to be part of it and taste these wines. And as the current winemaker, geez, fills me with awe and wonder, and also a bit of trepidation, because this is these are the shoes that I have to fill, and my goodness, what a pair of shoes they are. Wines are all spectacular. They, I think, have held up very well, and it's so interesting how you can see the evolution of the S&K style from Norm's days through to Chris's days and onwards. But still, you have that golden thread that always runs through them, and that lovely, pure, pristine fruit that goes all the way from the 75 to the 2018. It is really a pleasure to drink. The 53 Penfolds, of course, great surprise. Was very surprised and happily surprised with as well the fact that it is still so vibrant and youthful, even 70 years down the track, still drinking exceptionally well. Yeah, what an amazing experience, I think, and I look forward to, if I can make it half as well as Chris and Norm did, I think I'll be okay. So, thank you, Wendy.
Thank you, Adriaan. I'd like Cliff as one of our guests. Cliff, would you like to say a few words about the bracket of wine, seeing these are... Sure. Clifford is very up-to-date with Portuguese ports, and these are Australian, of course, so I'd like you to hear your comments.
So, I haven't had a huge amount of experience with Australian VPs until about a couple of years ago, where I bought an awful lot of bottles and opened them during lockdown, and it was a lovely experience. I agree with the comments. It's very, very interesting seeing the evolution. I particularly found this 1975 interesting because I believe it was in cognac barrels that it was left for 12 months, and I actually love the Pfeiffer 97 as well. I think that's a beautiful wine. It's actually one of the wines that I drank during lockdown and thought, wow. Australians really know how to make great vintage port. And if you ever manage to get a Hardy's 1975, if you ever see that in auction, I would buy it. It's excellent. And thank you so much for the invitation. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for being here. And before Jen and Chris, or Jen or Chris make a comment, would somebody else like to comment? I mean, we're all friends here, and I would really love to hear your comments, even if these are brief comments.
It's a wonderful look. I'm sure everyone is just totally delighted by having all this incredible wine in front of us. Just seeing the taste going from a very young wine right through to a very old wine, but appreciating that even the younger wine is nice for what it is. So thanks very much to all you people here.
And Jen or Chris would like to...
Oh, both.
We'd like, and big voices. Can everybody hear down the back? Wonderful.
A couple of comments. Firstly, the 1953 Penfolds is a single vintage tawny. That's one of the differences when you see it doesn't have that same structure on the palate as the rest of those wines. And that's similar to the Paras, all the Paras that everybody was running around for years buying. Similar thing, a tawny-based style from a single vintage that was bottled. And so how they mature is going to be quite different. This is a lot better than when we opened it. This was sealed with a stopper cork as well, whereas the others were all sealed with what we call table wine corks or flush corks in the bottle. So theoretically the seal's not as good in a stopper cork, but splashing it in around and getting some air into it, it's really freshened it and lifted the wine up, and it looks quite attractive there. So that's a South Australian wine. Now there's a wine there that says Bailey's, and if you look carefully at your notes, you'll find that's a South Australian wine as well. So that's made from fruit grown in the Riverland and the Barossa, and it's made from Portuguese varieties. So there's a little link between those two. And there's probably a little link between the Penfolds and the 1975 Stanton and Killeen in the fact that the Penfolds would probably have been made from Shiraz, Grenache, Mataro. There would have been some white grapes in that as well when that was made. And the Stanton and Killeen is Shiraz. So that's the only 100% Shiraz there. All the others are starting to show the influence of the Portuguese varieties that come in. Now, one of the reasons that Portuguese varieties have been chosen in Portugal is when we add alcohol to it, we're diluting the wine. It's just like taking some wine, adding 15% water to it. You get that sort of dilution factor that impacts the fruit, the sweetness, and all those tannin. The Portuguese varieties have been selected, and the ones that have risen to the top relates to the depth of flavour, particularly on the mid-palate of those grapes and the flavour they give, so they take the dilution much better than Shiraz does. One of the reasons that we've gone away from Shiraz is it doesn't take the dilution as well, even though we call that a sweet mid-palate variety. It's got a lot of flavour in the mid-palate. It doesn't have that same depth of flavour. And this Shiraz is it's got nice richness. I don't know, it's probably in the book what the Beaumet is. I actually haven't looked at that. But you're getting that flavour and it's flowing through. With the other wines, you get that flavour depth because there's, in all of those wines, and there's a lot of difference in weight in those wines in terms across them, but they all carry good fruit flavour. And I think that's the fact that we've used the Portuguese varieties in it. It's been part of the style of Stanton and Killeen to have a little bit of Shiraz and a bit of Girif in with those Portuguese varieties as well. You know, Girif particularly, if you're trying to build the tannin level in the wine, it's one of the most tannic grapes that we as winemakers handle. So by getting some Girif into it, you can build the tannin structure in the wine and get a little bit more of that dryness on the finish coming from the tannin there.
I personally really love the 92. I don't know if anyone else enjoyed that, but I
Fruit's great in it.
yeah, I thought, it's about 30 years old, so in a wonderful window. Yeah, terrific spirit, great integration of the spirit, a lovely generosity of fruit, but without being too sort of sweet or chocolatey. But yeah, just wonderful flavour and persistence. But like everyone else, I appreciate what a great opportunity it is to be here and taste this, this fantastic bracket of wines and reminisce about how they've been made.
Thank you, Jen. That's the end of the first Australian bracket. Please take a glass with you if you want to go outside, go into the shop. It'll take 20 minutes for us to reset the table with our Portuguese wine. I just wanted to say about this bracket, Cliff brought the 1955 and the Magnum, the 63 Dows in the Magnum. And I was in Singapore in May at Vinexpo Asia, and I went to the tailor's stand. It was a very big expo, and I went to the Portuguese stand, and I struck up a conversation with the director of sales from Portugal. His name is Chris Forbes from the Taylor Fladgate Group. And I told him about our port tasting and our love of port, and that we knew David, etc., etc. He came to visit me on my stand, picked up my newsletter, and I had my ad for the port event. He said, "Oh, I want to contribute something. I'll put you in touch with my Australian contact who lives in Portugal, who spent a lot of time out here promoting vintage port for the Taylor Group." And so this fellow, Robert Bowers, who's also a director and has been with the company a very long time, an Englishman, he spoke to me and he said, "Well, what would you like?" And I said, "Oh, maybe something young. We have all sorts of different wines." And so what arrived in the mail were 2 bottles of the 1997 Taylors, 2 bottles of the 2007 Taylors, and 2 bottles of the 2017 Taylors. They were a gift to us. Wow. And it was really, really awesome. So we've sent them off some of our Portuguese table wines. But the other wines come from our cellar. So enjoy. Please start tasting and talking and commenting whenever you feel like it.
Well, this is such a special bracket of wines. It's quite easy to see why Chris Killeen fell in love with these wines and eventually almost developed an obsession with them. They're so special. They're elegant, they're powerful, they've got amazing depth of flavour and of complexity. To me, the Taylor's wines really stood out, anywhere from the 55 all the way to the 2017. the elegance and the power behind them as well was something truly special, and something that I really enjoyed.
I just want to say how wonderful it's been to attend this tasting event, and how generous Wendy and Stanton Killeen, the Pfeiffers, and Adriaan have been with sharing their thoughts and their experiences and their wine as well from the cellar. As an uneducated palate, I suppose is what I would call myself. I hadn't tried many really old vintage ports, but what a treat to be able to sit down and taste these really old ports amongst people that have stories and experiences that go along with the vintages and the bottles. It's just been such an amazing event to be involved with, and I hope that everybody else feels the same. I'm sure they do.
Well, how exciting was that bracket of wine? That was really fabulous. No more fabulous than the first one, but different. So I really enjoyed that. One of my favourites was the Gould Campbell. I thought that was gorgeous. So before Chris or Jen or Adriaan makes any comments, would anybody like to just make a comment or discuss any of the wines? We'd love your feedback.
I was just saying, it was interesting how calibrated my palate is to the Rutherglen sweetness, okay, compared to this very different experience. And then I realised that Taylor's 97, I think, is the ideal window for me. So we worked it out around 26 years old.
Yes.
And you had those beautiful aged characters, but still that leading fruit sweetness at the front. And that's the one that really sung for me.
And it's quite soft. I just said to Jen, to me it's a very soft wine. So lovely. Thank you so much.
I'd like to thank Stanton Killeen for me a 40-year journey of vintage port or vintage ale fortified. And it's been fascinating tasting the other European wines and comparing. And my palate's very much Stanton Killeen, and this has been quite unique. When I became the mayor of Hobson's Bay, I actually contacted Stanton Killeen, and our commemorative VP was a 91, and that became our commemorative wine for that year in 1996. So again, thank you.
Thank you very much.
I was just going to say, and sort of echoing the previous comments, it's a privilege to experience all this, and we really appreciate what you've put on for us today. It's something that otherwise most of us would never experience. Mm-hmm. And I think it goes to the idea that wine is something to be enjoyed with friends, family, and new acquaintances. And I think you've embodied that today in bringing out these things from your collection. And so we thank you very much. But I think it really, really does remind us why we collect some of these wines, because it's not just about having them or status or showing off or anything. It's about enjoying them with friends and experiencing and trying things and seeing what happens when you age wines. But yeah, we really appreciate the fact that you've brought out these special treasures from the cellar and all your commentary and expertise that adds to the experience. So thank you very much.
This is really remarkable. I talked about the different styles, and I can see if you have a brace of these Portuguese wines around you, you can perhaps understand why we two young winemakers back in those years, why they were so inspirational to us. Because they are beautiful drinks, and that's often forgotten in the whole process. They are just beautiful drinks. I really thought the 63 Dow's was purring today. Really purring in the glass. It just seemed to be there and singing to me and say, drink me, drink me, drink me. And there's not much left. I just want to throw to Jen for a bit, because even though she worked at Croft in 2007, she went to Vargelis, and she also went to Fonseca what's he called?
Pascal.
Pascal. She went there with David and tasting all these wines. So it's your turn, Jen.
I mean, for me, a great bracket of wines, and I think, you know, as everyone's commented, quite different to the Australians. And I think, you know, if I can use my great way of describing wines, they're tighter. You know, they're tighter than the Australians. The Australians have a bit more generosity, a bit more volume, and with the tannin structure of the Portuguese wines, they're tighter and firmer, and that's one of the main differences. It's really quite incredible how most of these wines will have been made, which is a very, very manual process. In the Douro Valley, it's very steep terraced vineyards. The lowest grapes are grown at around 100 metres above sea level, but the highest grapes in the Douro are grown about 1,100 metres above sea level, so it's really varied. Because of the terracing of the vines, there's minimal mechanisation in the vineyard, and everything for vintage style is hand-picked. In my experience, the fruit's coming in fairly small bins, and the fruit gets tipped onto the sorting table, and so then the fruit is hand sorted. From there, you know, particularly the older wines, probably the 17s has a bit more mechanisation in terms of the production, but the wines are foot trod. So in a lagar, which is not so dissimilar to these vats behind us here, so they call them lagars there. They're made from the granitic rock that is present in the Douro, and unlike these ones, which are sort of flat, they're a little bit, what's that word?
Undulating.
Undulating, rough. And so what happens when you're foot treading, you're pushing your foot down on the fruit, and it's not flat, it's rough, and it splits open the berries more. And so that's good for what we in the wine game call extraction. Typically, in a vat that size, Adriaan, do you know how big they are? Are they 5 tonnes?
Oh, yeah, look like 5 tonnes.
5 tonne. In a 5 tonne vat there, you could have probably at least 15 people doing what they call the initial cut of the foot treading, and that's a very serious thing. People aren't talking in that period of time except the leader of the marching, and they're all there doing right, left, like that for around 4 hours, and that initial cut is really, really important to the wines. From there, generally the wines undergo what we call a natural fermentation, so the yeasts that occur naturally kickstart the ferment. During this time, there's a combination of foot treading, but also a form of plunging. So here in these vats, Stanton Killeen would have a hand plunger where you push the grapes down into the juice to keep the cap wet and to extract the colour and the flavour. In Portugal, they have things which is called a macacos stick, which translates to a monkey stick. So you have a shaft like that and then fingers coming off, and you stand on the edge of the lagar and you twist your monkey stick like that, and you're really trying to break open the cap. Again, it's all about getting as much character out of the wine as possible. From there, you know, the vats are shoveled out generally into a little basket press and fortified immediately at pressing. So very, very labour intensive across the whole process, and they're absolutely delicious. Obviously, I have to say the 2007 is my favourite because that was the year I was there. But it's pretty tough because they're all really good.
Thank you, everybody. We really appreciate you travelling, as Tash said. We really, really appreciate you being here. And it's been a joy for us to host all of you, and with our dear friends and our special team. Thank you.